Thank you so much, Howard, for having this group together. Monica and I talked at the breakfast about how wonderful it is to have now a venue for people who are interested in this field, where it's not a huge conference where you're on the fridges, and so there's this exotic group interested in wisdom, even though this is gerontology, but a group specialized on this topic, a group that is interdisciplinary, and I think it's wonderful to have it because it already moves us forward. Now, I have the unfortunate role of talking when you are all in the low after your lunch, so I apologize for the tiredness that I may provoke in you in advance. I will talk to you a little bit about several things. Some experimental stuff that I have done that some of you are familiar with, others are not, and some thinking that I have done. I want to present a model where I hope it will stimulate some discussion, and hopefully will also answer some of the questions, at least from my perspective, provide one way to answer some questions that have been discussed today so far. Now, we're talking about wisdom. We have various questions about what is wisdom, and what I want to talk about today is wise thinking, the expression of wisdom in everyday life, and specifically those type of principles that are rooted in the Neo-Piagetian tradition, which is, by the way, where most of the work got the inspiration from Clayton to Baltus. Everybody pretty much who has claimed to study wisdom in the last 20 years looked at relativism or some kind of an integration of different goals, of different perspectives, of different interests. And they also certainly talk about it in the context of ill-defined problems. So that's the whole thing about Piaget, was that he was talking about very clearly defined problems where you have a solution, where the Neo-Piagetians were dissatisfied with that, because I think, well, in life, when you master social complexities, those problems are not well defined. You can't solve them rationally. You need other type of principles. Maybe they develop further in adulthood. So that's where that idea comes from. Now, just as an example, this is what I have been working on, but there are many similar examples where this type of thinking includes intellectual humility, recognition that your knowledge is limited, recognition of uncertainty and changes, consideration of different perspectives, and try to integrate these perspectives together. So I will use this as sort of as an example. Another conceptual definition that I want to provide today, when you think of wisdom over here, this is not how we think about wisdom. We think about wisdom in terms of the cultural historical context. I'll say some obvious stuff that has been mentioned today already. This person or this act is happening to be in a certain context. We think about the experiential context. Often we talked about the aging context or professional context, and it influences both the beliefs about wisdom, the lay theory or implicit theories, as well as the actual performance. What I want to talk about today is the situational context. We started studying that. In the 95, 96, there was a whole conference in Berlin on this topic. There's a book published about the role of social context. We really didn't start studying it empirically until a bit later. There was some works that Ursula Staudinger have done that have some complexity issues about the interpretation of the findings. So I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it is important, and we already sort of started talking about it at group setting. We have studies on cultural historical context, at least some preliminary. Japanese, at least younger Japanese, seem to be showing this reasoning more often in their life, maybe because of the culture encourages them, we don't know yet. Experiential context, different professions. Baltus' work has touched that a little bit on. Of course, the question of aging is contentious. Monica's work suggests that aging may be sort of taking one trajectory. Ursula Staudinger says something opposite, and I say the third thing. And really, we don't have a clue because we don't study longitudinal aging process. We just look at cohort differences. And I want to talk about the social context. In a sense, of course, I want to emphasize that in the socio-ecological framework, you have the interdependence of these different contexts. It's not like that if you focus on one, you can ignore the others. You have to consider all of them at the same time. one example from my work about the so-called Solomon's paradox. Why was Solomon so wise in one domain but not so wise in another, particularly personal domain? A lot of the wisdom exemplars that we take somehow fail in their own life. That inspired me to look at factors inhibiting and facilitating wise reasoning. The classic example that we gave is imagine your partner had sex with your close friend. Imagine your friend's partner had sex with another close friend. Think about it, reflect on it, what will you do? And then voila, the music happens, and you quickly realize that if you are doing it for a friend, you have higher limits of knowledge, compromise others' perspectives, and recognition of change. It's like, well, that's interesting. What could be driving this? Can we somehow create a situation where we would emulate the context where you are somebody else? And the idea there is that maybe there's something about decentering, taking a step back, influenced by self-distancing. And the idea of self-distancing is that, well, when you normally think about the personal conflict, you look at it like this. But maybe when you think about a friend, you look at it like this. So maybe you can take a step back and become like this other. That's what we have done. We cross that with self-talk manipulation, where you talk either the first or the third person. And what we find here for parsimony, this is a first principle component of wise reasoning, you eliminate this effect. So that is, when you talk about your personal problem from a distant perspective in the third-person language, the effect is indistinguishable and significantly different on all of these three groups from when you talk about yourself from a first-person perspective and think about yourself from a first-person perspective. So that's very nice. But one thing that I was interested about recently is the fluctuations of that in everyday life. We've done some experimental work. I've replicated this work across a number of different contexts. What about everyday life? Turns out we know very little about wisdom in everyday life because until recently we had almost no diary studies. So I did one, a 9-day diary study. This was done in Berlin. I was doing a visit in summer at Humboldt University. We got a community sample of adults who wrote about the most challenging issue of every single day. And we used some kind of a day reconstruction procedure where every single day they reconstruct the context of the situation, reflect on it, and then they indicate what kind of strategies they were engaged in. This is self-report during this reflection procedure. And we looked at intellectual humility. Do you think you need more information about this event? Ambivalence and predictions. They predict if it's positive or negative, if it's important to consider different perspectives, and so on. And what I will present to you now is a simple two-level random intercept model. What it means is that we'll try to parse apart variability that happens within the individual and variability that happens between the individual. We either collapse this across all days, and this will be just a mean score for each individual, and we look at the variabilities across this mean scores, and we look at the differences from this mean score for each single individual. That would be the within-person variability. So first, what do we find? In general, average zero-order correlation is 0.20, which means that if you want to understand the trait wisdom, at least using this approach, you need at least 6 episodes to get a reliability that would be sort of a Cronbach alpha of 0.7. The correlation of odd and even days is 0.48, which is not too bad. It's actually kind of similar to personality measures. So there is a substantial trait level component, similar to how there is a trait level component to many personality constructs. But what I was interested in is the variability. And the variability between people, sort of indicative of a trait, and the variability within. What you can see on this figure is that the variability between is much narrower than the variability within, which suggests that within each person there is substantially greater fluctuations from one day to another than there is fluctuations between people. And I think that's really worth pointing out. Because it suggests that we can capitalize on wisdom by studying the situations more. What we also observed is some systematic differences, particularly if we look at intellectual humility and self-transcendent components. We saw that in the situations in which a person reported being with somebody else, either with a friend or at work, they showed substantially greater ability to recognize limits of their knowledge, at least they reported that, and look at this from a third-person perspective, which is, in this case, I call self-transcendent perspective. and that's sort of, so these fluctuations are not random, they're fairly systematic. They happen to be higher in the social context than in the context when you are not in presence of friends or at work. So to summarize this, I showed you some evidence of Solomon's paradox. Ego decentering boosts wisdom. You may have known of this work, and more recent work on substantial variability invites thinking across days. So what I want to talk to you very briefly now is an interesting paradigm where I tried to provoke it. Like, what are the implications of context across different ways to study wisdom? So I want to talk about the epistemological framework and the possible educational framework. When we think about the exemplars, for instance, there is a historical context. Michel Ferrari has been talking about it, screaming almost about it for a while. We should be screaming louder. Because Michel is saying that, well, cultural historical context matters. The valuations of actions as well as intentions of the exemplars is happening in a particular cultural historical context, which is why we sometimes put different people as wise in one particular historical point in time. There's also experiential context. When we look at exemplars, we look at their life narratives in general, as well as situate their actions and intentions within that narrative of their life. We also think about the experiences of evaluator. Depends on the person who is evaluating the exemplars. He may be picking different points in his life, either due to professional experiences, age-related experience, and so on, different exemplars. And there is also, and this is very important, situational context. What influenced the person, this exemplar, to act in X or Y way? And also on the side of the perceiver, how do we appraise exemplar of wisdom's intentions in such a way that they would inspire us, that would create some set of admiration, which is this feeling of elevation that would both force us towards sort of greater sort of wisdom in our own lives, a sort of self-transcendent mindset and so on. So this, I think, is important to consider. So it's not only that context plays a role for consideration of wisdom as wise reasoning or wise thinking, but also when we think about other paradigms, certainly for lay beliefs, or when you consider who is wise in order to learn from it. Now, if you put this together, let me guide you through this very quickly. So I talked about this so far, right? The situation plays a role, the experience and the culture. I focused so much on the situation, didn't have time to talk about the others, but they obviously play a role. Now, I would say that in order to understand the wise exemplars, who are also embedded in a particular context, you need these forms of cognition that would enable you to situate the exemplar's actions in the context of the culture, situation, and so on, in a way that it would inspire us to act and to promote us to emulate their actions, if they are indeed inspirational. In turn, from the epistemological perspective, the reason why we have these exemplars, as well as generally lay theories of wisdom, is because we want to understand what are the key components that we should be calling wise. For instance, if you talk about Monica's work, the first paper you published, it's like Clayton and Barron have this model, and they call this is the key components of wisdom. These are the general principles. So let me create a scale to study these general principles. I hope I don't misinterpret that first paper. And in that sense, we are taking the exemplars, so general beliefs, to understand what could be the wisdom-related cognitions, which of course are embedded in the context, or their manifestation is embedded in the context. This model, of course, not only works on the level of the epistemology, but also on the level of us understanding how to teach wisdom and how to create contexts that would promote wisdom-related cognitions, as well as how to teach students to get wisdom by giving them some exemplars whom we have to situate in social context, in experiential context, and in the sociocultural context of their time. So only by putting it together can we really get an understanding both for how to develop programs and interventions, as well as how to enhance it on our everyday life through some nudges by talking to yourself in the third person, by creating a mindset where you give advice to somebody else or others that we may identify in the future. So this is my opening, and I know I'm a little bit over time, but I hope this will stimulate some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Igor, do you have a sense of which so you've shown that there is within-person variability over 9 days, I think you said, in wise reasoning. Do we have a sense for what those factors are that inhibit or facilitate that wise reasoning at this point? Can you explain that variability, or can your data do that in any way at this point?
Yeah, so the one example here was this. So the context where you are in the presence of other people is a context that seems to be promoting it to a greater extent than the context where you are not in the presence of other people. So that's one. We didn't look in this particular study at greater variability, but so I would encourage anybody around interested in diary studies or experience sampling studies to have, first of all, more than 9 days, but also to examine this question in detail, because I think that's really, really promising. I agree with you. So we found only that so far, but we just didn't ask much more than that. Excellent question.
Thank you, Igor, for a really stimulating talk. The question is the context you mentioned, situational context. It is really more subjective rather than objective, because you can have the same kind of situation, say being with other people, for example. For one person, it could be stressful. For another person, it can be relaxing.
Right.
So apparently, you have the same situational context, but the person is reacting differently.
Well, not necessarily. When for instance, that would be covered by the experience code. Each single individual has different sort of individual sort of dispositions, if you want, in personality, but also in the way how he or she may react to the situations you just described, driven partially by the experiences that this person had in his or her life. So I do think that that sort of accounts. Now, I do make a bold claim about that this is, for instance, the type of cognitions, but I also would say that this type of cognitions may be valued more or less in different cultural contexts. And in turn, think about it that these cognitions are partially inspired by our study of implicit beliefs, of exemplars, and other type of implicit beliefs. Well, then it would mean that the whole process is situated in the cultural historical context, as well as in individual context. So I do think there is quite a bit of room for variability across individuals and across sociocultural groups.
Hi, I have I guess potentially a two-part question. First of all, when you're doing your diary study over the 9-day period, I think I might have missed it a little bit, but it did sound, correct me if I'm wrong, it did sound overall that you were evaluating wisdom on kind of a self-awareness, like in a kind of distancing yourself like from the situation, looking at it as a third person. Yes?
Yeah, so one of the items that we tried to do, and this was inspired by my earlier work, but also Monica's work, and like others who talk about sort of this having the id not being involved as part of the construct. So we had items about sort of self-transcendent perspective when you reflect on the situation as being part of the construct. In this particular study, yes.
So based on that answer, so for particular wise or unwise situations, do the outcomes factor into whether or not you consider the person being wise in that instance? Like if they acted, for instance, like morally or not, if they met all the criteria of having distanced themselves, being self-aware?
It's an excellent question. We didn't look at the outcomes because this is sort of just reports on how they feel and how they reflect on the day. So the outcome there is just like their reasoning process. That's another excellent suggestion for what to do in the future. It's like if you can piggyback sort of items about efficacy and as well as maybe just general successful. It's often not trivial to do that when you do a diary study. It's like every day, because if you add, the more you add, the more through the iterations it becomes unnatural for people to answer it. But maybe subsequently you can get back to them for each single episode.
Okay, thank you.
So I really enjoyed your presentation. I really enjoyed the paper. So I'm just going to offer a suggestion for some exciting questions that can be looked at, and it's methodological, but doing diary studies on these types of questions, right?
Yeah.
So with the Big Five, you get this same level of variability, right? So within person variability in the Big Five is greater than the between person variability. And typically with the Big Five, you can do experience sampling studies where you ask people 5 times a day for 9 days for 2 weeks, and it makes sense because people enact Big Five relevant behavior all the time. Now, with the data that I showed, we did do an ESM study with post-traumatic growth, and we asked people 5 times a day. But on reflection now, right, I do think that with some of the constructs we ask people about, are people going to experience new opportunities for experiencing life 5 times a day?
Yeah.
Maybe some people, but for most people, if they get it once, that's great, right? So I think it'd be interesting going forward to think about, like, when it comes to daily diaries and experience sampling studies with these types of constructs, right? Now, as you said, doing a day study for a longer period of time is good. I think experience sampling could be good, but maybe, well, then how many days? How many times a day? It'd be good to get more than once a day, because then you can look at within-day effects, but maybe twice a day would be sufficient. And I don't know whether you've thought about these questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so don't tell that to Will Fleeson, but I don't think that experience sampling is the best approach here. And I don't say that because I did a diary study instead of experience sampling. I actually thought quite a bit about it. And when I talked to Jaap Dennison, who is sort of my personality person to go and collaborate on that project, because of what you said, I mean, because it is a reflective thing that doesn't happen very often, and it's situated in a context when you solve some kind of ill-defined problem or difficult, challenging situation. I mean, of course, you can try to do it for positive situations too, but because of that complexity, experience sampling doesn't seem to be the best approach to go, because people would just say, well, it doesn't apply. Most of the time, it doesn't apply. So maybe you can sample it like 20 times a day, and then suddenly it will apply. So diary seems to be better if you can target and specifically some episodes where they may not even happen every day. That's nothing. That's why you need more diary days, I think. But I agree with you that it's tricky with experience sampling here.
Right. And I personally am open to thinking about modifications, experience sampling, depending on the question. Right. Because there might be some of these dimensions would be interesting to get at least 2 assessments a day to see how people vary within a day. I think there'd be an interesting analysis you could do, but I agree that that would not be true maybe for all the dimensions.
Right. Yeah.
Way to help me, I could conceive of a study like this, Rwanda during the genocide and Rwanda today. The cultural contexts are completely different, and the skills that are required to be wise, in the one during the genocide, the skill is hiding, and in modern Rwanda, the skill would be forgiveness. Or another comparison would be a diary study in Englewood, and at the same time as a diary study in Evanston. And the focus would then be on what are the skills that people bring to bear that help them act wisely in each situation that is contextually quite different.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think that those are the type of studies that we should be doing more, and trying to understand this contextual nature more. Sort of like, I'm a wisdom researcher, partially I'm a cultural psychologist. So for me, it's natural to say, let's do more cultural psychology of wisdom. I do think so that at the same time that maybe because it's my egocentrism right now acting on me, I think that there's some kind of cognitive process, a metacognitive process, for instance, those that Baltus discussed, some of them that I try to use, that may be helpful under a variety of circumstances, because the ultimate essence of those processes is about being flexible, context sensitive to how to deal with information, how to handle knowledge, let's say. And those may apply both when you are in Rwanda 10 years ago and now, or and so on and so forth. So in a sense that they're just like general metacognitive ways of working through difficult situations. And difficulty may be different from one context to another, temporally or culturally, but we all encounter some kind of difficulties. So I think there's something common, but I think there's much more that is culture specific. I agree with you.
So I actually wanted to ask that question. What is culture specific? In other words, are there the situations that count in different cultures wherein wisdom is manifest? Is it the value commitments that individuals might hold by which they make the choices that would be pro-socially more or less wise?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a set of things that can probably vary across culture, and I'm wondering if you have thought about those kinds of issues, the goals, the value commitments, the frameworks, et cetera.
Yeah, we're actually doing a big study on that right now. I cannot tell you the exact results because much of it is sort of self-report, and that's tricky. So we try to look, I want to triangulate it with open-ended data, which I don't have yet. But we did find a lot of convergence in certainly lay beliefs and perceptions of social perceptions of a wise person. But we also found some variabilities. For instance, the warmth dimension, like if you think about warmth and competence, warmth dimension seem to be playing a somewhat larger role outside of North America. There were also some other sort of nuances. So we can talk more about it later, but I think this work is still in the inception. I mean, for instance, the work that Takahashi has done and others, and Yang, for instance, with Bob, more on lay beliefs as well as then subsequently on sort of like general narratives of wise people in Taiwan. I like that work a lot, but I think there's much more needed to sort of cross-validate it because it's always difficult with cross-cultural research if the responses that you get are not driven by some response biases, by some general beliefs, or by so-called relative deprivation. You don't have it, that's why you want it, for instance. So there's a lot of careful consideration need to take place. And I know that Michelle is doing a lot of fascinating work on this topic right now. My lab sort of starts to contribute a little bit. I think much more is needed.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.